Today's scripture passage is Galatians 4, 8 through 11 and 19 through 20. You're invited to turn there or follow along on the screen. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you, how I wish I could be with you now and change my tone, because I am perplexed about you. This is God's word.
Thanks, Brianna. Do you know how in advertising, often you'll find the people who are making the commercials, they use these before and after pictures? You ever seen that? Hey, Evelyn, how are you? So good to see you. I'm sorry, I saw you, thought, I got to say hi to Evelyn. Well, welcome to the North. It's good to see you. You like that? Yeah, do you like that new grandson? I bet you do. Anyway, Evelyn Canning, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, so yeah, before and after pictures, you know, it's like, what first comes to my mind is like Marie Osmond and Nutrisystem. This is what I looked like before Nutrisystem. This is what I look like now since Nutrisystem. Okay? And you've got like skin creams and stuff. This is what I looked like before I started using this product. Now this is what I look like since I've been using this product. And advertisers use these mechanisms to get us to want to buy the product, whatever it is. And it generally works because they keep going to it. They keep falling back and they keep using it. Well, that made me think a little bit. Well, when I read this section of Galatians, it made me think of before and after pictures, because Paul is kind of using a before and after picture in this. Look at what he says here in verses 8 and 9. He says, formerly, when you didn't know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you're turning back again to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? Insert, are you kidding me? You have to realize that this is the mindset of Paul as he writes these words. Now, he uses some terminology in here that sometimes in our culture we are a little bit sensitive to because of our history. He uses a lot of slavery kind of terminology in here, and we kind of shy away from it because of our history as a nation with slavery, so we're sensitive to it. But Paul never backed away from using slavery terminology. He found it very useful, very helpful, because frankly, I think it paints such a vivid spiritual picture for us. And so he used slavery imagery regularly. And it made me think, okay, have you guys ever done a self-examination and asked yourself, what is it that enslaves you? What are you enslaved to? Who are you the slave of? I mean, I can't answer that for you, and you could spend a lot of time trying to work through that. I think in many cases something comes right to the fore of your mind immediately when you think about that. What are you enslaved to? Is it a person or is it a thing? And is there a person that's behind that thing? What enslaves you? And then you could also ask yourself, is it always a vice? Does it have to be a vice, something negative that enslaves us? We kind of assume it's something negative like a vice. And your mind goes to certain things almost automatically when you start to think about the things that are vices that enslave you. But is it always a vice? Can you be enslaved to something that in general is really a good thing, but nonetheless it enslaves you? And I thought, yeah, I think that's possible. I mean, you can like to do things well so much that you become a slave to your need to do things well. You always have to be perfect, don't you? And you are so hard on yourself, and you're so twisted up over the fact that you don't perform perfectly all the time. So there's something that's really good has become a master to you in a very cruel and twisted sense. You are the slave, my friends, of whatever it is that you serve. Paul wrote elsewhere in another letter, this one to people who lived in Rome, in the 6th chapter of Romans, he said, "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey? Whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness." Which then leads to that same question, whose slave am I anyhow? Right now. Now back to Galatians 4, verses 8 and 9. Notice what Paul says. He says, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God," and we'll leave an ellipsis there for the moment. See those two conditions that are strongly contrasted? When you did not know God, and now that you do know God. These are supposed to be very different experiences, very different realities in our lives, and Paul contrasts them. Now, what is it Paul says to his readers, and to you and I by extension then, about those days before we really knew God? What does he have to say about those times in our lives, that situation in our lives? He says that in those days, we were slaves to things which by nature are not gods. And I thought another way to say that is you were a slave to anything but God. I was a slave to anything but God. Things that might present themselves to us as gods, but really are not. And that is what enslaved us at that time. Now, what's interesting here, and here's where I'm going to try to get to where I want to go with this message. At the end of verse 9, Paul refers back to those things that enslaved us but really weren't God. He refers to them again in another way, and he calls them weak and miserable forces. So, here's what burned my brain cells all week. What is Paul talking about in this section of verses when he refers to the things that used to enslave us, masquerading as gods, although they're really not, that he also refers to as weak and miserable forces? What's he referring to? Now, I have to tell you that that is a big discussion in theological circles. You might not have spent much time thinking about it, but I want to just try to shed a little bit of light on this subject for you, and maybe it will be meaningful to you. I hope and pray that it will be meaningful to you. But I wanted to know. Frankly, translators struggle on how to translate some of the terms and the phrases in here that Paul uses, and we, in our English versions now, are calling them weak and miserable forces. What is he talking about? What are the weak and miserable forces that used to enslave us that apparently we want to submit to again all over again? Now, I want to show you a phrase in the Greek New Testament, and I want you to see it with your eyes, and we're going to talk about it just a little bit. Here's the phrase. It's ta asthene kaipatoka stoikeia. That's what it looks like. And you see the last word in the phrase stoikeia, that's the word that really we're going to focus on for a while this morning. And I'm going to tell you that we're going to do this technical thing kind of on the upfront end, okay? We'll get it over with for those of you who don't like the technical stuff, but hopefully the technical stuff will wind up meaning more to you because we've talked about it, because it really is central to this whole point and what I want to talk about. So this phrase is translated in the NIV as weak and miserable forces. And you see that it refers back to that thing he said just a few phrases ago, those who by nature are not gods, but nonetheless, they wind up enslaving us. And he calls them weak and miserable forces. Now, that word stoikeia, look at the next slide. It's a fascinating word, and it has a lot of context in ancient Greek. It was used in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. But here's what it meant in the most fundamental sense. Most originally, it meant one in a row of things. Again, I pictured in my mind a freight train. Okay, what is a freight train comprised of? Cars in the freight train, okay? There's one car after another, after another, after another. At the beginning, you got an engine. At the end, you got a caboose, right? Okay? But it consists of these building blocks that we call cars, freight train cars, freight cars. So the cars then would be called the stoicheia. These 1, 2, or 3 of a series of things. Okay, like in the alphabet, you could walk through the alphabet. Let's yank out the letter E. Okay, we're going to examine the letter E. Well, the letter E is one of the stoicheia. It's one of the things that comprises the entire series that we call the alphabet. Okay, that is the most fundamental and basic meaning of the term stoicheia. So how does that have anything to do with what Paul is talking about? And where do we get some spiritual meaning and application for us today because of this word? Hang on. We got to walk through a series of things, okay? Now, look at the next slide. Thayer's Greek lexicon it defines the word stoicheia as this. Stoicheia refers to any first thing, an original thing, something that you got to have in order to have something else. It's sort of, like I said, a building block, okay? Any first thing from which the others belonging to a series or a composite whole take their rise. In other words, the whole couldn't exist if it weren't for these things, these stoicheia, these first things. The first things, the rudiments, the fundamentals. Okay? You see there at the end, an element, or element of something, or first principles. Now, what's on the next slide? Okay, leave that there for just a minute here, and I'll see if I can catch up to where I'm supposed to be. How is stoicheia used, this ancient Greek word? It's used in a number of different ways. You know how words have different shades of meaning? They can mean different things in different settings. Well, this one would be no different, okay? Stoicheia has a number of different meanings, which I think are helpful. So let's walk through some of those, okay? First of all, the word stoicheia is sometimes translated as to denote the letters of the alphabet, the fundamental building blocks of speech. You'll actually see the word stoicheia used to refer to letters of the alphabet, ABCs. Okay? Now, the second way that you see it sometimes used, stoicheia is sometimes used to refer to the elements from which all things have come, like the material building blocks of the universe. You've got hills, you've got mountains, you've got rivers, you've got oceans, you've got trees. These would be the stoicheia, out of which is composed the material universe, right? Or you could break it down smaller. You've got molecules and proteins and things like these would be stoicheia, right? Now, a third way that it is used, stoicheia sometimes is used to refer to the heavenly bodies, referring to the parts of the solar system or the universe, like you've got the sun, you've got the moon, you've got planets, you've got stars. All of these things are the things which comprise our solar system, our universe. So stoicheia would refer to all of those little bits and pieces and parts, right? The word is actually used in ancient Greek to refer to these things, okay? This is what I want you to see. It is often used to refer to each of these things. Now, the fourth one begins to get a little bit more metaphoric, and here's where it sort of takes a turn. It is often used to refer to the rudimentary principles of any art or any science or any discipline. You can see some of my examples there. For instance, the ABCs of music. If you want to learn music, you're going to have to go to the beginning and learn the rudiments of music. Jason, as a drummer, learned the rudiments of playing the drums, okay? Those of you who are into chemistry, when you began, you learned rudimentary, fundamental components of what chemistry is about. The initial things, okay? So you see what stoicheia are. It's these little component parts that make up something bigger. Now, why are we talking about this? Because Paul likes this word. He uses this word repeatedly in his letters. And he uses it repeatedly in this specific chapter. Matter of fact, I kid you not, last week when my wife got up to read the scripture, actually this was before the service, she came to me and she was going to read the passage for the morning, which was earlier on in chapter 4. And she noticed this one weird translation of this very word. And she says, I don't want to read that version. I like, it says it this way in this version. And I said, well, it's going to be on the screen this way. I want you to read this version because this is the way it's going to be on the screen. We don't need to confuse people, okay? And the whole point is it's translated differently. It's a complicated word to translate, all right? Stoicheia is. But it's important because Paul used it a lot. And what in the world is he referring to in this letter when he keeps referring to the stoicheia, these weak and miserable forces Stoicheia is used a couple of times in this chapter. In verse 9, here's how it's translated: the elemental spiritual forces of the world. And that's the phrase that my wife used in her reading last time. I had her use that one. The elemental spiritual forces of the world. What are those? Well, he uses the same word again a little bit later in the same chapter, and it's translated as those weak and miserable forces. And again, what are those? Now, notice the adjectives that are used for it in that second translation. The first word is weak. Weak and miserable force. Weak, sickly, frail. Picture a person who's been on chemo for 6 months and stage 4 cancer and really clinging to life. That is an adjective that he uses to describe these spiritual forces that prevail in our world today. They're on life support, and yet they seem so prolific. And then he uses a word that we translate here as miserable. Actually, that word is better translated as poor, destitute, like a beggar. That's why the King James actually translates it as beggarly. These forces are beggarly. They are without a penny. They have nothing of value to offer you. They're on the receiving end. They're begging, these spiritual forces that pervade your world. However, they used to enslave you, and apparently you still want to drift back and be enslaved to them again. This is what Paul is so amazed at. Now, I found a paragraph written by Charles Swindoll, who's a really good down-to-earth teacher, about this term as he is engaging it in the New Testament and specifically in this passage. And I wanted to share with you this paragraph because, again, as we are compiling one stoicheia upon another to try to get somewhere. All right? Here we go. Swindoll wrote, this term stoicheia is used in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12 to refer to the basic truths or the ABCs of Christianity. In Galatians 4, verse 3, however, the word designates the world's physical elements like the sun and the moon and the stars and the planets, which in Paul's day, this is important, were thought to be controlled by gods and goddesses. Think back to Greek mythology. Okay? Now, Paul thought of that differently. Paul believed that those false deities were actually demons. They weren't deities and deises. They were demons impersonating, and people were worshiping them as deities when they were really demonic forces. Now, that's very important. Hang on to that. Therefore, says Swindoll, stoicheia in Galatians 4, verse 3 probably refers to the demonic forces that temporarily control our world. Now you understand why he might be talking about being enslaved. While we were unsaved, he concludes, condemned by the law, we were in bondage to evil spirits. The law did not enslave us to these powers, for God gave the law. However, and this really goes hand in glove with a quote that I gave you from John Stott last week about how Satan took something very good in the law and got us to relate to the law in a way that God never intended for us to relate to the law, which was really a very good thing. Here's what he says. However, Satan used the law to fulfill his own wicked schemes. So Swindoll has touched on something really important here. Yet another way in which stoicheia is used, and this would be the fifth sense of the word. I did not share with you this one earlier, but here it is, the fifth sense of the word stoicheia. It is sometimes used to denote the demonic forces which lie at the root of or influence much of human thinking, relentlessly perpetrating what I will call false fundamental ideas. False fundamental notions that and I lost my place, false fundamental ideas about how we are supposed to relate to God. You ever notice how the world is filled with philosophies about how to relate to whatever is above and beyond us? Where do all those ideas come from? I think this is what Paul is getting at when he uses this term here. It seems like this is what Paul has in mind. Paul is maybe, and this is the next slide, Paul is maybe describing those most basic and fundamental notions that we as human beings hold for living, notions that pervade the world currently and always have, like notions about why do we exist? How are we supposed to live? What am I here for? How am I supposed to relate to that which is beyond? How am I supposed to relate to a creator if there is one? The world has never been short on ideas for this, right? You recognize that? The world is filled with ideas and philosophies on these subjects. Where do those ideas come from? There are ideas and principles that seem to come so naturally for us human beings. Some of these ideas you will recognize very quickly and very easily. How about this idea? Work hard and get rewarded. Where did we ever learn that idea? How did the idea get sown? It's not a new idea. It's been around forever. But nonetheless, it's an idea that you and I hold. It's the idea that people hold. You work hard, you get rewarded. How about this notion? If you want people to be nice to you, be nice to them first. Okay? It is certainly an idea. It is certainly, where did it come from? You remember that book, Everything I Ever Really Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten? Okay? Where did we get these ideas? Okay? How about this idea? Do good things, get good things in return. You do bad things, you get bad stuff in return. Where did the idea come from? But nonetheless, human beings everywhere have always held to it. So these are a sort of what I would call fundamental building blocks, sort of a stoicheia for the doing of life. ABCs for living life in this world as human beings generally tend to think, right? There are a million of those little truisms, and we live by them. They seem to guide how we behave in the world. But do we ever ask ourselves, where do they come from? Is there somebody pulling strings back there in these things? And this, I think, is what Paul is getting at. We so often forget, guys, that there is a being, and this is on the slide, there is a being which the New Testament calls the Prince of the Power of the Air, which is a really weird title, isn't it? The Prince of the Power of the Air. What does that even mean? Well, I'm going to give you my crack at it. This is a phrase that I believe describes the pervasive influence, the pervasive control that Satan has over the general sphere and the general inclinations of the human race. His distorting touch and his perverting influence are everywhere. You cannot escape them. You run up against them and run into them time and time again, over and over, all the time, every day. And all of this talk reminded me of when I was a kid and I would watch certain programs. I remember watching Gilligan's Island just shortly after it was not new anymore and it was in syndication. And I remember one episode that had everybody on the island getting hypnotized. Anybody remember that one? Yeah. Some of you do, some of you don't. There was actually an old Fred Flintstone episode, The Flintstones, where Fred inadvertently hypnotizes his next-door neighbor, Barney Rubble, and so Barney thinks he's a dog. Have you seen it? Do you remember it? Yeah, and he can snap Barney in and out of being a dog. Okay? And I thought of hypnotism. I thought being under the influence of something else and not even being aware you're under the influence of it. Well, whether it's a good analogy, I don't know. That's not my point. I just want to create a word picture for you, a picture in your mind. And it made me think, the New Testament says that the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, blinded the minds of the world at large in general, in certain ways. Paul might almost have said that prior to our knowledge of God, prior to our knowing God, prior to our coming to know God, this was our state. Unknowingly blinded and enslaved to ideas and principles for living that have been, frankly, satanically crafted and satanically influenced. But the prince of the power of the air, with satanic intention behind the crafting to lead us astray as it comes to our real purpose, as it relates to how God, our Creator, would have us relate to Him. All of these various ideas of how to relate to God and how to live life and so forth. Do not for a minute think that they haven't been sown by a malevolent being. Not everything is equally bad or equally distorted. But I'm telling you, there is a hand in it. Now, one of the ways that I believe this satanic influence has manifested itself is in what I will call, for the sake of this message, and this is the title of the message, guys, the gravitational pull of the law. The gravitational pull of the law. Think of a couple of pieces of magnet there. Where you think, and I always have to think of what the compass needle does. No matter how you spin it around, it's always going to, you know, that gravitational thing. What do I mean by the gravitational pull of the law? I mean by this, that thing in your heart that constantly tries to default to performance merit as opposed to grace. You know it does. And frankly, why are we talking about this? Because this was the issue that drove Paul to write the letter of the Galatians. Here were some people who had supposedly been the recipients of God's extraordinary grace, and they understood that apparently, but they wanted to go back onto this way of performance merit thing again, which just drove Paul berserk, which is why he wrote the letter. Now, where do you see this gravitational pull of the law in your own life? And if I don't help you to see this, then I think I have failed. I want to try to help you to see where it's located, perhaps somewhere in your own heart, because I believe it's there. It's that thing inside you that causes some people, when they think of mass murderers like Ted Bundy becoming a Christian in prison, causes them to say, "Bah! I can't buy that. There's no way a person could do that and live that way and then receive God's grace." You know where that notion comes from? Gravitational pull of the law. Guess who is in control and manipulating that good thing, the law, so that you conclude there is no possibility of grace? The gravitational pull of the law is that thing that causes some people to say, and I've heard people say this over and over again as a pastor. For years, I've had people come up to me and they say this almost arrogantly, "If I ever set foot in a church, the roof will cave in." And, come on. Do you think you're a special sinner? Are you worse than everybody? They take pride in the fact, thinking that, well, I've never had anything to do with God, and the roof will fall in if I go in that building. And what's at the root of it? There's nothing from God except payback for the way that I've lived my life. Gravitational pull of the law. It's that thing in you. And I know you're in this room where it says, I can't possibly be forgiven for what I have done. It is just too bad. There is no forgiveness for me. I can't possibly be forgiven for this particular thing. This particular thing that I have done over and over and over. You know how many thousands of times? I can't possibly still be loved by God and acceptable to Him. You recognize that voice is the gravitational pull of the law. Who is manipulating that in your head? It's that voice inside you that says, I must stop this bad behavior or God will be done with me forever. That's the gravitational pull of the law that leads you to conclude that. All of this, and I could go on and on, it reveals our heart's tendency to pull towards that default position of performance/merit. And I have to tell you, it is a delusion. It is a deception crafted at the hands of the god of this age, the prince of the power of the air. And here's what's interesting about it. It appeals to something that's good in us, what we might call personal responsibility. But it takes something very good in us, personal responsibility, and twists it into something demonic, and I will call it prideful autonomy, self-dependency, which leads to an inability to receive grace. Now let's go back again to Paul's initial use of slavery kind of language. There was a day, Paul says, that you and I had another master. And it was not a master that is God. You may not have realized it, but you did. You just were doing what seemed to come naturally. But in fact, Paul says, you were enslaved to something that is not really a God. You and I, guys, were born into this world with a propensity to serve ourselves. Have you ever noticed that? Yeah, at least nod your heads to show me you're awake, okay? You and I were brought into this world with a natural propensity to serve ourselves, which is in reality right where the enemy of our souls wants us to be, and he labors hard to keep inflamed within us this self-serving propensity. And he would continue to keep us ensnared in the pursuits of our own desires, our own appetites, our own ambitions, even our own self-salvation projects. But here's what you need to understand. I want you to hear me say, that is not what you and I were made for. You and I were made for another master with a capital M. We were made for the pleasure and the purposes of our Creator. And you and I will never be truly free until we are in alignment with that purpose for our lives. And it reminded me of an illustration I had to use. It had been 3 years ago I used this illustration, but I just love the illustration, so I'm going to blow the dust off and use it again. I used to keep aquariums when I was a kid. I loved aquariums, and I loved swordfish. Not swordfish, but swordtails. The red ones, well, they even have green swordtails, but the red ones were always particularly, the red velvet swordtails. Anyway, swordtails are just incredibly beautiful tropical fish, and yet the only problem with swordtails is they always want to jump out of the tank. And what is up with those things? They are notorious jumpers. They're these magnificent fish, and you invest your money in them, and tomorrow morning they're going to be dead on the floor. They won't stay in the tank. And there's no comparison between the way a swordtail looks when he's alive and in the tank and when he's shriveled up gray on the floor, dead. And I used to think to myself as a kid, what are you doing? I mean, look at you. And that's what you wanted? Are you serious? That's where self-actualization gets you? That's where self-will gets you? Pretty much. Now, the swordtail is only the breathtaking thing that it is when it is where it's supposed to be, when it's in the parameters of the water. It gets out of the water and it's over. So let that be an analogy of your purpose for living. You're never going to be what you are designed to be. You're never going to experience the freedom that you were designed to have until you are in line with the purposes that drove the Creator to make you. Think of the swordtail trying to get out of the tank. That's what we do. That's the way we live. Why is this gravitational pull of the law, this self-actualization thing, why is this so strong in us? And I realize I'm trying to bring together two streams that don't necessarily fit perfectly hand in glove, but we're going to try to do it anyway. Why is this gravitational pull of the law so strong in us? And I wrestle with that. I don't know that I really know. I have some ideas. I'm going to share with you 3 reasons why I think it's so strong. And it's so strong in you, in you, in you, in you. And there's none of you that are accepted. It just manifests in a different way. One reason I think it is so strong is because there is great insecurity in giving up control. There's great insecurity in giving up control. Think about it this way. A voice in your head that says, I can't possibly receive something good without deserving it. You see the control that's inherent in that? I can't possibly deserve something good unless I have deserved it. There has to be cause and effect. Do you know how rattled we get when cause and effect doesn't hold true for us? The vending machine. I mean, how many times have you gotten ticked off at a vending machine and wanted to kick it or turn it over when you put in the money, you ran your card through it, and you pushed F5, and out came something you didn't ask for, or out came nothing at all? You are so addicted to cause and effect that just makes you want to blow your head off. And if you don't think that's true, how about those of you who have raised children? You have raised children, and they've become adults, and you thought you did everything right, only to see that your children did not embrace the things you wanted them to embrace. And you're like, what did I do wrong? And you can hardly live with the fact that cause and effect does not come together here. It just like blows your brain. And I'm serious. I can relate to that. So there is this thing, the cause and effect nature of things. Now there's a second reason that's beyond just the control issue of cause and effect. And I'll call it the pride of self-dependency. I used to play racquetball with a guy who, frankly, I don't know how to say this, he just couldn't keep up with me. Okay? And he didn't like to get beat, but you know what he hated even worse than getting beat? He could not stand if he thought that you weren't giving it your best. If you thought you were dumbing down your game. He'd get furious. He says, I don't want no charity. Don't be giving me charity. And he would get livid. That's charity. And it wasn't. But if he thought it was charity, if he thought that you were giving something that he didn't deserve, he would go nuts. You know what it is. You know you want to feel as though you earned it. You know you want to feel as though you deserve what's coming to you, especially if it's anything good, like you actually win. So there's the element of control, there's the pride of self-dependency, and then, as I said before earlier, I'm just going to sum it up as this third point here. The God of this age, frankly, has blinded our eyes. This is what he wants. To the point at which one could almost say that we are hardwired with this gravitational pull of the law in high gear. And I think, frankly, it takes a supernatural birth, a second birth, a birth from above, to have this principle overturned in us. But you know that even after the second birth, after the spiritual birth, you know that sucker still lingers. That's why the Galatians are going back to it. That's why Galatians was written. It's then a lifelong journey to have the grace of God take over more and more territory in our lives. And it's like the Titanic struggle that was the Super Bowl last week, with one team slugging and the next one, boom, boom, and finally someone comes out the victor. But what a struggle between those two offenses. Well, that same thing is at work in you. God's grace, God extending you grace, and yet you are constantly wanting to be pulled back to performance merit mode. I remember when the astronauts first walked on the moon, and they got out there, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and they planted the flag on the lunar surface as though the whole lunar surface was under the empire of human beings at the time, which couldn't have been further from the truth. I mean, what would it take for every square foot of lunar surface to actually yield what we want it to yield? Well, that's going to take a long time, right? The flag is just symbolic, right? But if you're really going to colonize the lunar surface so that every inch of it does what you want it to do, that's another story. Well, that's the way the law is in your life. God has planted this flag of grace down in your life. And yet there is years of trying to work out the implications of grace so that gravitational pull of the law is driven out of you, and it keeps wanting to come back. But here's the good news. Philippians 1:6 tells us that we can be confident of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. And God has no equal counterpart, duking it out like two Super Bowl teams. No, that is a misnomer. There is no equal force slugging it out with God. He will win. He will have his way. So what did this gargantuan struggle look like in the life of the Galatian believers? Look at verses 9 through 11. Paul wrote them with this fervor, and he says, how is it that you're turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Now you know what those weak and miserable forces are. Hopefully, after we've talked about it all this time, the satanically manipulated ideas about how we're supposed to live life in the world, getting points. Okay? Why are they turning back to them? What are you doing? He says. Why are you turning back to the miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You're observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I've wasted my efforts on you. So what were these special days, months, seasons, and years? Well, it was Judaism. It was the seduction of the performance merit of Judaism. Okay, we're going to worship on Sabbath now because that's the right thing to do. And God will be pleased with us if we worship on Sabbath now instead of on Sunday. That's what they were starting to do. They were observing Passover and Yom Kippur as though these things were necessary to make God pleased with them and to bring them into his family. If they ever stop doing those things, God will kick you out. These were the things that they were reverting to. And they weren't even Jewish to begin with. Somebody was telling them that you got to start doing this if you really want to be right with God. And they were buying it. Why? Because of the gravitational pull of law. So as we conclude this morning, I want to remind you of a quote that I shared with you precisely a month ago. Okay? Again, I just find it so important. I want you to see it again. I always love the way Tim Keller summarizes the gospel in terms that surprise you. Okay? Here is the one that I shared with you 4 weeks ago. I want you to see it again. He says, the Bible's purpose is not so much to show you how to live a good life, and I would insert the words, as though by living a good life you get points with God, because that's what we mean. Okay? The Bible's purpose is to show you how God's grace breaks into your life against your will and saves you from the sin and brokenness otherwise you would never be able to overcome. Religion says if you obey, then you will be accepted. But the gospel of God is this: if you are absolutely accepted, and you're sure you're accepted, only then will you ever begin to obey. And he says, those two are utterly different things. Every page of the Bible shows the difference. Now, I'm going to conclude with Paul's passionate plea and appeal to the Galatians. Verse 12, the first part of it. Listen to him. He says, I plead with you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I became like you. And I thought, I don't think I could ever tell you, become like me. That's freaky. You know, I don't want you to become like me. I know too much about myself. So what is he saying here? Become like me, for I became like you. When I became like you, he says, basically, I came among you with no bondage to the Jewish legal code. No legal code. I came among you as free. And I lived the gospel of grace before you. What are you doing? Become like me. Paul is saying, he was referring to his absolute dependence upon the grace of Jesus and his complete freedom from any kind of performance-based merit approach to God. And so, since I understand that's what he means, I guess I can say that to you. Guys, become like me. May I confess? I am completely dependent upon Jesus, upon his grace, or I am lost. I have nothing of my own to commend myself to him. It is his grace or bust. Become like me, okay? Become like me in that.